Bonjour à tous. Time is not helping us, so I'm going to be very brief. But asking to all speakers to have the 20 minutes, not less. And so that we can, at least not things a little become later. This first section, I will ask you to not lose our time to consult the speaker's biography. I'm just going to say that Professor Jeremy Hour is professor at the University of Buckingham. He's been extremely studying on the old masters painting and collections. And this is coming to bring a talk on this morning's section. La génération grandiose, les grandes demeures du Gilded Age is the background of the Gulbenkian's time and the opportunities for creating such extraordinary collections on these times. So I will thank you, Professor Jeremy Hours, to speak about Héritage à vendre, l'éclatement des collections ancestrales au Royaume-Uni, 1880-1920. 20 minutes. It's on the title. I read it on the title. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. When I'm not teaching, I wear another hat, which is as head of research, academic projects, and so forth at Carnegie. And in terms of the Carnegie side of my life, our relationship with Calouste Gulbenkian was somewhat frustrating because letters in the archive show that we tried to sell him a lot of things, and then for reasons which, in fact, Charles Diaz touched on, I think the price was always not quite right. So anyway, I'm going to be talking today about the breakup of the great British ancestral collections, which of course gave the opportunities to collectors like Gulbenkian and others and his predecessors as well in the Gilded Age to form great collections of their own. And the reason why, really, in a nutshell, the British aristocracy were such a good source for art collections was the fact that they had been phenomenally rich during the 18th century, the age of the Grand Tour, and had also been able to profit hugely from the breakup of the great collections, particularly in France during the time of the French Revolution, but also elsewhere in Europe as a result of the Napoleonic campaigns. And the fact that towards the end of the 19th century, and I'm going to say a little bit more about this in a moment, they found themselves in a very different situation, greatly impoverished, most of them, not all of them, and therefore having to sell off the family heirlooms. Now, until the last quarter of the 19th century, sales of large ancestral collections in Britain were relatively rare, except in cases of gross extravagance leading to bankruptcy. Two rather exceptional cases were the Hôtel sale of 1778, where Sir Robert Walpole's great art collection was sold by James Christie to the Empress Kathryn the Great of Russia in conditions of great secrecy. It wasn't a public auction at all, it was a private treaty sale. And the reason it was a private treaty sale was because the family wanted to avoid unwelcome publicity. Though the politician and radical campaigner John Wilkes raised a storm in Parliament arguing that the collection should be saved for the nation to form the nucleus of a national gallery, which of course wasn't to happen for another half a century, really. The second rather remarkable dispersal of a great aristocratic collection was in 1848, when, as a result of the gross extravagance of the second Duke of Buckingham, the great Stowe art collection was sold off again by Christie's, but this time with all the shame of a public auction, which lasted for a biblical 40 days and caused tirades in the press, with one Times journalist saying that the Duke might as well have been selling off the bones of his ancestors as disposing of his ancestral collections. I think a lot of the feeling raised by the Stowe sale was connected with the great political upheavals that were taking place in 1848 in continental Europe, and the fear that this was a sign that things were going to the dogs in England as well. Some of the bones, incidentally, from this ancestral collection ended up in the Wallace collection. One of the speakers, of course, Suzanne, is a curator there. In both cases, the sales caused outrage, exacerbated in the case of the Stowe sale, as I said, by the political upheavals of 1848, but also by a strong sense that bankruptcy and the dispersal of an ancestral collection was very much the result of moral turpitude. And this message comes across very strongly in Martineau's painting The Last Day of the Old Home of 1862, where as a result of the husband's extravagance, and we can see him on the right quaffing champagne and also teaching bad habits to his eldest son, it brings about this sale. And again, you can see, in fact, details of the painting. From that, we know that the sale was also being conducted by Christie's. And as was the case at Stowe a little bit earlier, the heroic wife tries to keep the family together. Incidentally, this rather fuzzy slide on the right is of a watercolour in the Royal Collection, which shows really the pride before the fall. This was the occasion of Queen Victoria's visit to Stowe, and the watercolours by somebody called Joseph Nash. And one of the things, the final nail really in the coffin of the family fortunes was the incredible amount of money that the second Duke of Buckingham spent on that royal visit. But in the mid-Victorian period, British collections, British private collections, were still the envy of the world. And if the National Gallery could certainly not compete with the Louvre as a museum, the huge lone exhibition of art treasures from British private collections, which took place in Manchester in 1857, was so impressive that even the French had to say that it was a show that rivaled the displays in the Louvre. Within 20 years, however, things had started to change radically. And by 1880, 65% of wheat was being imported from the USA, and Britain was in the grip of an agricultural depression, which was charted with great pathos in Herkomer's Hard Times, where we can see these agricultural workers who've been turfed off the land in a sort of Victorian version, in a way, of the rest on the flight. But spare a tear or two for the aristocracy, because they were also feeling very hard up, hit not only by falling land revenues, but also their situation made much worse by the introduction of death duties in 1894. In a Punch cartoon called Depressed Dukes, the Duke of Devonshire says to the Duke of Westminster that if things continue as they are, he will not be able to afford to have a tomb over his head, let alone a roof. It was a very bad time to be a British duke, but a rather good time to be a banker, a diamond merchant, or an art dealer. By 1914, roughly half the art treasures which had been included in that magisterial photographically illustrated catalogue published by the dealers Colnaghi and Agnew's, Gems of the Manchester Art Treasures exhibition, had been dispersed. The beneficiaries were a handful of museums, a large number of European and American collectors, and, of course, the auctioneers and dealers who acted as their intermediaries. Now, one of the problems faced by the aristocracy was that because of the complicated system of entails, of family trusts, designed to protect family property from the extravagance of people like the second Duke of Buckingham, as a result of this, it was very difficult to sell off land or heirlooms to pay for the roof, or even the tomb to be repaired. But in 1882, the Settled Land Act was passed, a crucial piece of legislation which made it possible for lands and chattels, that's to say private property which is not land, paintings, etc., to be sold off, provided that the money was held in trust for the heirs. So you could cash in your Rembrandts and put the money into stocks and shares, which were actually performing rather well in the last quarter of the 18th century. This had an almost immediate effect in terms of encouraging a spate of ancestral sales, beginning with the Hamilton Palace sale of 1882, which saw one of the dispersal of one of the greatest private collections of, inter alia, French 18th century decorative arts. And this was swiftly followed 4 years later by the Blenheim Palace sale of 1886, which saw the breakup of a highly important collection of old master paintings, which is why if you go to Blenheim today, all you really see are family portraits. All the great old masters have gone. Now, Blenheim was particularly celebrated for its collection of old master paintings. What is now the library at Blenheim was actually where the paintings were displayed. And the end of that library, there is this great sort of 1880s organ, and in that space hung the one of the three great equestrian portraits by Van Dyck of Charles I. This picture, together with Raphael's Ansidei Madonna, which I've misspelt on the caption, I'm sorry, were sold off, both of them achieving record prices. £17,500 for the Van Dyck, £75,000 for the Ansidei Madonna. Both of these were, in fact, sold off prior to the Christie's sale of 1886 through a private treaty arrangement. Now, the Raphael price is particularly remarkable because up until that point, really there were no sort of comparable prices. The last great Raphael to come on the market was actually in the 18th century, and that had fetched £8,000. And the National Gallery had fairly recently paid more or less an equivalent sum, 9,000 and a bit, for Leonardo's Madonna of the Rocks. But £75,000 was really establishing new price levels. Now, where was all this art going? Of course, ultimately, and later on in the story, a lot of it ends up in America. And the narrative, the traditional narrative, really, of what I'm talking about is very much the breakup of European collections and all the works of art going off to America. But this is an oversimplification because, of course, there were great European collectors too, Gulbenkian, of course, being one example, the Rothschilds being the other. Many of the best pieces of French furniture and Sèvres porcelain were acquired for Waddesdon Manor, that extraordinary French chateau in the middle of Buckinghamshire, by Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, who created some highly influential interiors combining French decorative arts of the highest quality, as one of a pair of Riesner commodes, which came from Hamilton Palace. Most of the Sèvres porcelain also came from the Hamilton Palace sale of 1882. And this French furniture and Sèvres porcelain was displayed together with great 18th century portraits by Reynolds, Gainsborough and Rumney, a combination which very much set the tone for the great American collections of the Gilded Age. Now, one of these American collectors, albeit a very cosmopolitan American collector who was domiciled in England for a lot of his life, was J.P. Morgan, who had in many ways the extraordinary eye and omnivorous and very wide-ranging appetite for collecting, which resembles that of Calouste Gulbenkian. Agnews, who supplied so many of the paintings by Gainsborough and Reynolds, which you see at Waddesdon, moved in the 1870s from being one of the top contemporary art galleries to being leading dealers in old masters. pioneering the taste for British 18th century portraits of society beauties, which were to become so much the taste of the American Gilded Age clients of Duveen. In 1876, William Agnew paid a record 10,000 guineas for the portrait of Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, more than the National Gallery had paid around the same time for the Leonardo Madonna of the Rocks, and sold it to Junius Morgan, the father of J.P. Morgan, at what would have been a handsome profit. But just as the picture was about to be delivered, it was stolen from Agnew's gallery and rediscovered in Chicago in 1901. J.P. Morgan agreed to pay £30,000 for it in 1901, which is in fact more than Isabella Stewart Gardner had paid for Titian's Rape of Europa. And this created new price levels for ancestral portraits. Generally, they had to be female and pretty, which were bought initially by British collectors such as Lord Iver and, as we've seen, Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild. But this was a taste which was very much to become the taste of the great Duveen clients, such as Frick and Henry Huntington. How am I doing for time? I've got 10 minutes or 5 minutes. Oh my God, I'm doing terribly. Okay, so I'm going to whiz through now. 6 minutes. Okay. So just very quickly then, Colnaghi's were one of the dealerships that become very much involved in the breakup of these collections, and this is the Lord Ashburnham's collection of 1894, from where they acquired the first Botticelli to go to America. This is the Death of Lucretia, and also this extraordinary Rembrandt, which was sold to Berlin. Rather interestingly, the Botticelli goes to Isabella Stewart Gardner, but Berlin was still a very important force in the market in the 1890s. The great sort of, one of the great sort of headline sales, as it were, of the 1890s was the sale of what has been described as the greatest Italian Renaissance painting to go to America, Titian's Rape of Europa. And here you can see Bernard Berenson, who was the intermediary in that deal, and in fact over a space of not very long time at all, between 1894 and 1902, Colnaghi sold over 24 great works of art through Berenson to Isabella Stewart Gardner. And these are letters written to the Earl of Darnley, who owned the picture, and one bit of a letter written to Bernard Berenson, who was going to be offering the picture. Now, very much spurred by the kind of the entrance of the Americans into the market, which becomes very significant in the early 1900s, there are attempts to try and stem the flow of artworks from England. England, of course, Britain, I should say, was in this sort of unenviable position of having had great art collections and having been the most avaricious nation in terms of, not avaricious, avid collecting nation in the early 19th century, but the boot was very much on the other foot. So the National Art Collections Fund is founded in 1906, and one of their great early triumphs was rescuing Velázquez's Reliquary Venus. And that caused remarkably little controversy, but when in 1909, 6 years later, the Duke of Norfolk decides to sell his family Holbein, which had been on loan to the National Gallery for over 25 years, and it sold through Colnaghi's to Henry Clay Frick. This is when really the storm comes out, and there's this great outcry. In fact, Henry James wrote a play about it called The Outcry. And here we can see this Bernard Partridge punch cartoon of the wicked American with his bag of dollars trying to remove Christina, Duchess of Milan, from her frame and drag her onto a waiting liner. And it says underneath, "Once on the liner, and the girl is mine." Well, she was rescued, you'll be glad to hear, at the last minute through the National Art Collections Fund, and a mystery donor an English lady in a German watering place whose identity has never been revealed. But this, I think, creates an extraordinary mood of hysteria, and 1909 really is a really crucial year in all that. Now, Frick was furious to have been cheated of his prize, and so Colnaghi and their American partners, Knoedler, had to try and find a consolation prize. And the consolation prize was these two wonderful portraits by Van Dyck of Franz Snyders and his wife Margarita de Vos, which had been in the Orléans collection, and they arrived in England in the late 18th century. And by the early 19th century, they'd been split up between two aristocratic collections. And were in two different castles, at Castle Howard and at Warwick Castle. Well, Colnaghi and Knoedler managed to bring husband and wife together again, very nicely, reunited, but in Frick's collection. And interestingly, we have the correspondence about the Snyders portrait, a lot of detail about it, and how one of the clinching features of the deal was promising that a very, very high-quality copy would be made of the Snyders for the Earl of Carlisle and put back in the original frame so nobody would know the difference. Now, 1909, of course, was a crucial year in other respects, and one of the crucial things was the passing of the Payne-Aldrich Amendment, which removed the 20% duty on the importation of works of art into the USA. Morgan had kept nearly all his collection in England, in fact in London, in Princess Gate. A lot of things were also on very long-term loan to the V&A. They almost overnight go to New York. And here you can see JPM with his magnet of dollars, and I'm about to finish. Just going to finish with a couple of things which are very much the culmination of all this. This is Gainsborough's Blue Boy, not in fact sold on the Aquitania, although there's a wonderful story about it in the highly unreliable biography of Duveen by Berman. But it was bought en bloc with another Gainsborough and Reynolds's Mrs. Siddons as the Tragic Muse in a sort of en bloc purchase. And when it was sold to Henry Huntington, it was the second most expensive picture in the world. And my last example, just to show you that it's not all about impoverished British aristocrats and Americans with their bag of dollars. This is a painting bought, in fact, from Colnaghi's by Henry Lascelles, Earl of Harwood, in 1919 for £60,000, which is 3 times what Isabella Stewart Gardner paid for the Rape of Europa. And this is an example of a really wealthy British aristocrat putting together a great art collection in the early 1920s. And the Titian was what remained in the collection of the family until 1970, when it came back on the market at Christie's and was threatened with export to America. But, like Holbein's Duchess, was saved from the clutches of Uncle Sam, I think it was going to go to the Getty, by the National Art Collections Fund. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Professor Jeremy Howard, to prepare this wonderful presentation and also to prepare the set, the scenery for the actors we're going to follow.
Oh, right.
Maybe the rubber bearer, the trophy hunters and tastemakers, the robber bearers and Artworld spectacle in the Gilded Age that will be presented by Dr. Kathryn Brown from University of Loughborough. She's a specialist in the 19th century French art and also from the art market. And this is a great moment also from our morning.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. And thank you so much to our co-hosts for organising it. It's terrific to be with you today. And I'm very glad that my talk follows on from Jeremy's, because I'm going to talk about those pesky Americans and delve into that a little bit more. Now, I'm conscious of the fact that I'm using the term robber baron. And that in itself is a contentious term. Is it unfair to group such a diverse bunch of people under this term of robber baron? We have, and these are 4 other people I'm going to talk about. Henry Gurdon Marquand, one of the founders of the Met, head of an insurance company and also a financier. more mercurial character, Charles Tyson Yerkes, based in Chicago, who was responsible for financing the urban infrastructure of Chicago and indeed the London Underground. He also spent 6 months or so in prison for misuse of public funds, but we'll skip over that. John Pierpont Morgan, who we've just heard about, perhaps one of the voracious collector of the late 19th, early 20th century, and one of his competitors, Henry Clay Frick. Robber barons. How does that capture women's contribution to collecting over this period? Isabella Stewart Gardner. Louisine Havemeyer, I dare say we'll be hearing more about her later when Frances gives her talk, and even Mary Cassatt, who of course was a wonderful advisor to so many collectors during this period. Well, robber baron might be a good term to use because it really does capture something about what was going on at the time. Now, Jeremy mentioned Henry James's The Outcry. Yes, it started as a play and then it became a pretty bad novel. You could read it if you want, but it's not one of Henry James's best works. But it's interesting for our purposes because what it does is capture the idea of what the robbing was in the term robber baron. The novel concerns a British family that's selling off all of its artworks. And one of the British characters says, looking back nostalgically, we rummaged around Europe and we found works. What are those Americans doing? They're coming here and they are pillaging those works. So we have the amateur versus something much more professional in terms of collecting. The character goes on to say, things are going out of our distracted country much faster than they ever came in. It's that difference between rummaging and pillaging that I'm interested in. This was something that Wilhelm von Bode spoke about in a terrific essay of 1907, Die amerikanische Gefahr im Kunsthandel, the American danger in the art business. Now, von Bode was the head of the Gemäldegalerie in Berlin. He went to the US in 1893 to see what was going on, and he was really jealous of the sheer amounts of money that these people had to undertake their collecting. And in this essay, he talks about a train of artworks going from Europe to the US. And I think he chose that word train very purposefully to capture the railroad tycoons who were making all of these fortunes. But there are two other points in the essay that really interested me. He talks about a growing interest having spurred a greater understanding. And he also talks about US public and private collecting starting to organize itself systematically and scientifically. That's the key transformation. And that's what I just want to focus on for the next few minutes. I'm less interested in people collecting those trophies, those trophy works, and I'm more interested in the coordinated activity of these individuals to produce an art world in the United States. And I'm drawing on Howard Becker's famous discussion. He wrote a book about art worlds in 1982, where he talks about a set of common practices, common understandings, conventions developing around art in a very concerted fashion to create a system of values and ideas about what art and its environs should be. So I'm interested in three sort of follow-ons from collecting in the United States. I'm interested in collecting as foregrounding or even creating an epistemic culture, a knowledge infrastructure about art. I'm interested in what these collectors did to promote a particular social value system in which art is central. And I'm interested in the way in which collectors create a spectacular culture around art, a spectacular visual culture of art. Now, it's worth thinking a little bit about where we start in the US. And I came across this wonderful little snippet in the New York Times from May 30th, 1855. And it's actually headed, The Difference Between Art in America and Art in Europe. And the writer talks about an exhibition, the annual exhibition of the American Academy of Fine Art. And he says, look, there's stuff there, but really no one cares about it. These exhibitions in America of American art attract little attention. You might get a few oysters and champagne at the vernissage, but that's about it. The papers pay little attention to the show. He contrasts that with a show of the same year at the Royal Academy in London. And there we hear the guests amounted to 180 gentlemen, including the most exalted in rank, political influence, wealth, and genius. There were dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, barons, baronets, all the rest of it, and bankers. Okay, so now we're getting the financial class hobnobbing and becoming part of a certain kind of art aristocracy. I'm going to move from there, and I'm very glad Jeremy showed us the Duchess of Devonshire, because it was one of the acquisitions by Pierpont Morgan that really sort of helped to nail him, his sort of the image of him as a collector. But I was interested in this description of Morgan from 1902 in an American journal, the Journal of Education, where it gave a kind of portrait of Morgan, a man of broad and deep culture, the owner of the famous Gainsborough. And this is my favourite quote. "What manner of man is this mighty potentate of wealth, whose doings are now so momentous as though he were one of the crowned heads of Europe?" Okay, here we are in the new world, it's a new democracy, and what do we want? The crowned heads of Europe. Well, isn't that just dandy? Well, how do you become this cultural legislator? It's not just by buying individual works. You've got to make a splash. And Morgan didn't just buy individual works, he bought whole collections. 1902, he buys 2,000 pieces of Chinese porcelain. 1909, he buys 1,500 old master drawings. And perhaps most famously, he buys the Hôtel collection of over 3,000 objects, collection of medieval art, 19th century woodwork, furniture, tapestries, paintings, and so on. Buys it and gifts it to the Met in 1907, loans the medieval works indefinitely, and essentially creates a whole new department, the Department of Decorative Arts. That's a massive shift in emphasis of the whole institution. And indeed, they had to build a new wing to cope with the collection. And it's wonderful, you can access all of these Metropolitan Museum of Art bulletins from the early 20th century on the Met's website. And they actually talk about the creation of this wing and how they copied the architecture of the Louvre. You can see the comparison there. The lighting's different, but it's the same kind of principle. So buying these massive collections, actually sort of changing the balance of public collections. This was something that was satirized by 1912 in the New York Evening World, when the cartoonist says, look, there's actually no room in the Met anymore for Morgan's collections. What are we going to do? Why not hang them in the subway? And then we could have more people looking at them, we could see them, and so on. This is only part of the cartoon. It goes on even further. So what else then? I said we need to think about the impact of collecting and the creation of a kind of knowledge system around art, an epistemic culture. I go back to Henry James. He says those Americans are coming along, these Yankees on the spend. They're doing business with treasures, with English lords lopping off branches of the family tree. But the other thing that James talks about is the introduction of a modern science of connoisseurship. We're getting new intermediaries, new agents, new cultural brokers, including people like Bernard Berenson. Including artists. There's a telegram from the Anglo-American artist George Henry Boughton to Henry Gurdon Marquand, telling him what to buy and giving him the prices, telling him to wire Agnew for any of these. Collecting also spurred a brain drain from the UK to the US. We have people like Sir Caspar Purden Clarke moving from the V&A to the Met. Roger Fry, of course, became curator of paintings at the Met in 1906 for a while. And we also need to think about how this ties in with educational frameworks. Yale starts offering fine arts courses in the 1870s, Harvard follows in the 1880s. And in 1882, Alan Marquand, the son of Henry Gurdon Marquand, starts teaching early Christian and Byzantine art at Princeton. And guess what? His dad pays his salary. So there you've got Henry Gurdon Marquand buying, giving to the Met, installing his son as an educator at Princeton, again, creating this art infrastructure. Now, these men may be part of the story, but there were also opportunities for women. Belle Greener, for example, who became Morgan's librarian. Her father was the first African-American to graduate from Harvard. He later went on to head up the law school at Howard University. Belle faced considerable racism, of course, at the time and had to reinvent herself. She invented a Portuguese background for herself, renaming herself Belle da Costa Green. And she became quite a celebrity, written up in the Omaha Daily Bee as the librarian who earns a salary of over $25,000 a year, the woman who earns big wages. She was also noted for her behaviour in auctions. She was there buying up rare books for Morgan. And here you can see her as the bachelor girl, still in her 20s, but outbidding these professionals at auction. So women sort of appearing in these interstitial spaces created by this traffic of art between the US and Europe. I'll mention one other woman, Sarah Tyson Hallowell, who was Chicago-based. She curated exhibitions in Chicago. She arranged the loan of French art for the World's Columbian exhibition. She also ended up working in Paris as an agent for the Art Institute of Chicago, and she worked as an agent for collectors, including the Chicago-based Charles Tyson Yerkes and Bertha Palmer, who became Mrs. Potter Palmer, again, a Chicago-based collector who created an incredible collection and eventually ended up in the Art Institute of Chicago. And there you have Hallowell portrayed by Anders Zorn, and there you have Mrs. Potter Palmer herself also portrayed by Anders Zorn in the same year. I'm just showing you one work that Mrs. Potter Palmer acquired that is in the Art Institute of Chicago, partly because I like it, Renoir's Acrobats at the Cirque Fernando. Also because it's a work from which Mrs. Potter Palmer would not be separated. Apparently, even when she went on her travels, she would take the picture with her. Now, this brings me to another aspect of the creation of an epistemic culture, the power of print. Catalogues are incredibly important, not just any old catalogues, but catalogues that are there and created as fine books. Charles Tyson Yerkes had a splendid collection of Persian carpets and wanted a limited edition set of catalogues produced of the collection. It's beautifully illustrated. And one of the catalogues sold in 2022 at Christie's for about £20,000. But the illustrations were produced by female watercolorists based at New York School of Applied Art and Design. And I have to say, they're absolutely staggeringly beautiful in their rendering. Of course, Pierpont Morgan could never be outdone, and the catalogues of his that he commissioned for his works, I mean, they're like medieval books in their own right, again, with very beautiful illustrations. So you don't just rely on collecting, you need to document it, you need to create something beautiful around it, and something that will last, even if your collection is dispersed. And that brings me to another intersection of print culture and art trade. Auction catalogues. Again, very important and interesting to see how they develop. Liane Zalewski has written about the changing form of catalogues in the US, the way in which they started to mirror European catalogues. And you can access a lot of these online. The Yerkes catalogue is increasingly showing you details, biographical details of the artist, sometimes provenance. So we're getting much more complicated background information about the art and about its ownership. And increasingly, those auctions become more and more spectacular. John Ott, I'd mentioned his work here, has written about blockbuster auctions in the late 1880s and early 1890s. George Seeney's auction of modern paintings was one of those auctions. All of these taking place at Chickering Hall in New York. The Stewart collection was auctioned off in the 1880s, and you can see the kind of theatrical event that the auction was. As our lead collectors start to die off, so too their collections are increasingly coming under the hammer. Henry Gurdon Marquand's collection selling at auction after his death in 1903. And I want to mention, if we've got these high-end auctions, beautifully documented and works presented in a particular way at one end of the market, I'm going to mention a different kind of auction that you may not have come across, and that's a Jack the Ripper sale. I came across this wonderful description in The Collector of March 1, 1891, where the author said, this week there was a Jack the Ripper sale in this city. What does he mean by that? He's talking about the paintings literally being slashed from their frames, frames undoubtedly being sold off somewhere else. The paintings left begrimed and dirty, stripped of their frames, no show, they fell the prize of whom? We'll never know. A little bit salacious, but there you go. This brings me on to my sort of last example that I want to mention, and this is the porosity, the movement. We've talked about the movement of art from Europe to the US. Now I want to think, just to end up with the movement from private collections into public hands and back again. So after Pierpont Morgan's death in 1913, Jack Morgan shows the private collection at the Met. It's got around about 4,000 objects shown between 1914 and 1916, including Fragonard's Progress of Love. Now, one of the things that I always worry about in my own research is the proximity of public and private collecting. I worry about the way in which our public culture can be eroded or have tensions placed on it by the private. Here, you've got Jack Morgan using the Met as a showroom, essentially. He's using it to show these works and to gather the potential interest of buyers. And sure enough, we have people sniffing around the Fragonard panels. Nördler was there looking at them. Duveen notices Nördler looking at them, thinking, uh-oh, he's going to buy them and sell them to Frick. I'm going to gazump him. I'm going to get in there first. And indeed, Duveen did. He went round to Jack Morgan and said, I'll give you $1 million for the lot. Jack says, okay, great. And you're going to have to pay me another $45,000 in order to get the frames, the mouldings and everything so you can install them. Frick says, okay. So what's nice, I think, here is the headline in the New York Times. Jack Morgan selling the Fragonard rooms. They've been in the museum. It's almost as though they've been absorbed into public culture. And now they're going back into private hands. They're going back into a private house. But a private house that, of course, becomes ultimately a public collection. So we've gone from private to public, back into private, and then back into public. And that, I think, and sort of chiming in with our theme of today, becomes increasingly a point of interest in the documenting of private collections in the US. So this is a very important book, I think, Mr. Vanderbilt's House and Collection. It's Cornelius Vanderbilt's eldest son. And the text is as important as the imagery. This is the revelation of a private home, we're told. A typical American residence, well, I doubt that. But anyway, a typical American residence when the nation began to have a taste of its own cultural autonomy. And we, the reader, become guests of 19th century gentlemen. And you do get a sort of tour of the whole house through this catalogue come narrative. You can see what it would be like through print to inhabit this world. My penultimate slide. I end with Morgan's death in 1913. It's the year of the Armory show. It's a change in taste, it's a change in the whole shifting nature of the art world. But what interests me in this obituary for Morgan, written in April 1913, was not the obituary, but another bit of information about American art. American art is booming, the paper says. The sales from the Academy exhibition are good. Can it be that our native art is coming to its own with the waning demand for seemingly any but the best and famous paintings by early foreign masters at enormous prices? When Henry Gurdon Marquand started buying trophy pictures and gifting them to the Met, he did so in part with the hope of stimulating a market for American art. And he did so. I mean, I think that it's fair to say that. But let's have a caveat there. It's a particular kind of art. It's a particular kind of Anglo-European set of values. It's an art world that occluded folk art, indigenous art, art by Black Americans, and in many cases art by women. Nevertheless, from Gilded Age to an art metropolis, I end with a work by an Ashcan artist, John Sloan, looking to New York, looking to those skyscrapers. We're 1922 now, that shining light in the distance. And I think this is in part where we end up from this transition of European art and its migration to the US, New York and the US as an art cultural capital. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's so vibrant, and I think we're going to have quite a great discussion after. And now, following the public and private collections, and Duveen, I ask Vera, Dr. Vera Mariz from Lisbon University. She's been studying the Gulbenkian house at the Avenue d'Iéna with this presentation. Well, I have translated French to English, sorry. Cet homme en génie, the man is a genius, l'hôtel particulier, Gulbenkian's hotel particulier, through the eyes of the Duveen Brothers.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So when we look to the photograph of 51 Avenue d'Iéna that were taken in 1956, this is right before the collection was transferred to Portugal, there is a feeling of nostalgia and stillness that is very much, that surrounds the idea that this was the last place where Calouste Gulbenkian saw all of his works of art brought together under the same roof. So these photos offer us, of course, a precious insight on the layout of the collection on site, but the pulse and the vibration of the house itself is almost undetectable. So the collection and its layout were not permanent. This is the premise of the project, the ongoing research project that we have now at the Calouste Gulbenkian Museum about the layout of the collection on its early days at Avenue d'Iéna. This is from 1927 to 1936, from the moment where the collection first started to be staged in the house until the moment of the long-term loan to the National Gallery of London and the British Museum. During this time, only a privileged few were granted access to the house. Among these were Joseph Duveen and his associates, such as Edward Fowles, whose impressions will kind of guide us today in this brief tour through one of the finest houses that they ever seen. And given Duveen's unparalleled knowledge and insights of the most lavish Gilded Age houses, this is, of course, no small thing. Although Gulbenkian bought the 51 Avenue d'Iéna in 1922, he knew the building inside out since 1907. Such fact is entangled with Joe Duveen and one of his first great achievements as an international art dealer, the purchase of the art collection of Rodolphe Kahn, the original owner of number 51. In a masterstroke, Duveen and his partners on this deal, Wildenstein and Gimpel, got the Kahn heirs to keep the house for 7 months so they could display the objects on site, therefore fooling the interest of the public and increasing the value of the collection that was about to be put up for sale. Gulbenkian name stands out among the more than 900 names registered in the Livre d'Or, as he was one of the few that visited the number 51 in more than one occasion before the collection was dispersed. Although the books show us 4 visits in September 1907, the correspondence with the Duveens show us that Gulbenkian got to see the collection even before the house was open for public visits. As a result of these earlier inspections, Gulbenkian asked about the manuscript illuminations and books and attempted to secure the right of first refusal of Titus Rembrandt. The masterpiece should have been promised to Benjamin Altman by then, which explains why Duveen turned down Gulbenkian. Later, he would write to Joseph again about other 11 pictures from the collection. Among these were a Fragonard, likely the little swing that would enter the collection of the Contents de Berrague, Velázquez's Portrait of a Little Girl, and Goya's Historiador, which were also reserved for an American client, which now we know was Arabella Huntington. The sums that the American magnates were willing and eagerly to pay were astronomical, which must have put off Gulbenkian. In the end, apart from 2 sculptures then attributed to Riemann Schneider, he placed the winning bid on 2 Guardis. That same year, he would buy from Agnews other 2 landscapes, which would form the base of what turned out to be the largest single collection of Guardis anywhere in the world. At request of Gulbenkian, the objects purchased at the Cannes sale were sent to 27 Quai d'Orsay, for which he had recently signed the rental contract. The apartment on the brand new building designed by Richard Bauern's van der Boyen was the epitome of modern luxury. However, similarly to his London house, the space for displaying the growing art collection was limited, and for the time being, the ensemble continued to be dispersed through his residence and accumulated as storage at art dealers such as the Duveens. The high standards that guided every aspect of Gulbenkian's life, as well as his sharp powers of judgment and wise approach to any kind of investment, would postpone the acquisition of a bigger house for more than 20 years. During this time, he had a network of lookouts compiling news on buildings that were about to be put up for sale. Among the several hôtels particuliers, palais, chateaux, and even islands that were about to be put up for sale, and Gulbenkian was then receiving information on them, was, for example, the nearby Hôtel de Crillon. These buildings were not necessarily intended for permanent residence. Some were considered for leisure, as it was the case of the Château de Chenonceau in the Loire Valley, one of the deals Gulbenkian admittedly regretted the most not doing. Others were intended for business, as shown by the purchase of the Hôtel de Coislin, also nearby, for the Société Maritime des Pétroles. Joseph Duveen made its business to identify and anticipate the desires and needs of his clientele. Being aware that Gulbenkian was in the market for a new house, in 1920, Duveen broke the news about the potential sale of Château de Beauregard, nearby Versailles, by then leased to Arabella Huntington. The art collector was not convinced. Not only he was seeking for a place to buy rather than a new leasing, but unlike its American owners and conspicuous consumers, he sought out an estate solely for his own pleasure and not for parade, as he put it. In the end, it was the father duo, Nathan and George Wildenstein, that finally met his high expectations. The property purchase of 51 was considerably long and somehow reminiscent of the proceedings taken in the acquisition of works of art. The 51 had been kept in the Cannes family until 1910, when it was sold to the American investor and financier Percival Farquhar. Less than a decade later, the railroad millionaire would sell the house to Madame Marguillier, from whom Gulbenkian would buy it in 1922. Before making any decision, Gulbenkian visited the place several times and sought out the expertise of an architect, Walter André Destaillers, who had built the Hôtel Wildenstein and visited several other buildings at request of Gulbenkian. Although Nevart, Gulbenkian's wife, was more inclined to have a new house in London, on April 10, 1922, the Aguilar Estates Company, owned by Gulbenkian, became the new owner of number 51 Avenue d'Iéna. All those years looking for a house to display the collection and all the browsing of collections for sale in their domestic settings allowed Gulbenkian to build a fairly good idea of what he wanted. Indeed, when he reaches 3 different teams of architects asking for their proposals for the renovation, they are immediately handed with a program. Its key points were a finer staircase, a better lighted entrance hall, with the whole of the rooms around disposed to show off the collection. Much to the surprise of Destailleur, the final project was entrusted to Emmanuel Pontremoli, who joined forces with the firm Muse and Davies, with whom Gulbenkian had a 20-year relationship with. As regard the decoration, the project was assigned to Adrien Karbowski, who had previously worked with Pontremoli. The project was colossal in scope and daring in its complexity, and yet, regardless of what challenges could arise, the much anticipated result should be, as always, nothing but only the best. In fact, these incredibly paradigmatic codes that one can easily identify with Gulbenkian and his high standards concerning the acquisition of art actually refer to very mundane things, such as electrical equipment, bathtubs, and washstands to be installed in number 51. The Duveen Brothers followed the process closely as they had a vested interest in its success. As always insightful Fowles observes when hearing of the offer placed by Gulbenkian for the house, this purchase had the potential to be a game changer. The art collector was enthusiastic as never before and truly invested in turning the place into a sort of a museum, as Fowles reports back to Duveen. The size and scale of the building were so massive that although allowing to gather the collection under one roof, it would also call for new and better acquisitions. Fowles' assumption was right. When analyzing the dealings between Gulbenkian and the Duveens, two things stand out. The first is the relation between the rise of the oil prices in the afterwar period and the jump on the value of the purchase, as Jessica also showed for Islamic art. The second is the value of transactions reached its peak in 1923, right after the purchase of number 51. On the contrary, while the construction was progressing, the values dropped as Gulbenkian became aware that it was wiser to wait until the house was in a more advanced state before making any big buys. Then, once the works were drawing to an end and the artworks were on place, the figures increased once again. Mrs. Launderstone, the Gainsborough from the Carnarvon collection, the most expensive of all these purchases, was in Gulbenkian's opinion even better than the acclaimed Blue Boy that we saw earlier today, one of the pictures that he says to have lost for Joseph Duveen and his American and Duveen prices. Gulbenkian shared with Duveen an infatuation for Gainsborough and especially for this lady. So when Joe tried to get him to sell it so that he could complete a set of Gainsboroughs in his own New York house, the oil dealer expressed his indignation. It is tempting to imagine Gulbenkian in his grand salon, enraptured by his dear lady friends, this in particular, Mrs. Launderstone, being one of the pictures that is absent from the photos, as by then it was on loan to the National Gallery of Washington and whose resting place has remained unknown so far. From the moment of the acquisition of 51, Gulbenkian visits to the Paris Gallery of the Duveens became more frequent. During these visits, he would share his plans, ask for advice, report the work progress, leading Fowles to say that this man is getting more in our hands every day. This does not mean that Gulbenkian followed every piece of advice, not only due to disagreements over prices and taste-related matters, but mostly due to the lack of suitability of the objects to the house. It was crucial for Gulbenkian to achieve an harmonious result in every room, and while some of the spaces were designed around objects that were already part of the collection, such as the Giulio Romano tapestries from the dining room that you can see in this photo, for others it was necessary to find pieces that would complete decorative schemes. Notwithstanding, Gulbenkian had a collector's greed for acquiring things, as he confessed, so even if there was no place for an object, its purchase would still be considered with a view to a future use. Furthermore, the house had several rooms for storage, of course. To have a clear out and to sell the small odds and ends of the collection to create more space could have been an option, but then, as Gulbenkian jokingly said to Fowles, people would say that he had gone broke. Fowles was a frequent visitor to the house, reporting back his impressions to Duveen. This talk borrows its title from one of the letters sent from Paris to New York. Unlike other compliments that were simple flattery, this remark, in particular about Gulbenkian genius, was confidential and therefore absolutely disinterested. Fowles does not elaborate, but it's fair to assume that he was not only impressed with the aesthetic qualities of the house, but also with the remarkable level of technological innovation. One of the aspects to which Gulbenkian devoted more attention was the heating. While most houses were still using coal and even wood, 51 had a central heating system that ran with liquid fuel oil. In order not to spoil the decoration in the reception rooms, an invisible system that used hot air gratings was used rather than open radiators, as it was more common. The lighting system and the hygrometric state of the air were also extensively studied by Gulbenkian himself, especially for the gallery of paintings. From the reception rooms to the climatized vault and the cold room where carpets were stored, the program to be followed was clear. It must combine the greatest efficiency, the most up-to-date methods, and the best materials to the exclusion of useless squandering of money. The decoration of one of the most iconic areas of the house is intimately linked with the Duveens. Gulbenkian desired to have the finest staircase in all of Paris, yet such aspiration was not new. Indeed, in 1899, at the time when the apartment in London was being remodeled, Gulbenkian had already expressed the desire of having a beautiful stairwell and banister, such as the one he would later commission to Edgar Brandt for Avenue Diana. The decorative scheme asked for a tapestry to be hung on the first floor landing. However, to find a piece that was good enough and large enough proved to be a difficult task. For almost a decade, the Duveens invested in fulfilling the expectations of Gulbenkian. But in the end, it was the collector himself who found a solution that relieved his growing anxiety about this element. During a trip to Amsterdam in 1925, Gulbenkian got to see the collection of Camillo Castiglioni, which was about to be sold. Among the treasures, it was a tapestry that had just the right size. It was not of the finest quality, it had been restored, and it was quite pale, and yet he asked Fowles to bid on it. We know now that this was the Beauvais tapestry after Boucher, known as La Pipée aux Oiseaux. Gulbenkian saw this as a temporary solution, a piece that would play an important role in the decoration until a better one was found. Aware of this, the Duveens continued to offer him large tapestries over the years, such as a set of 3 pink tapestries from the Gobelin that complemented the sofa à confident. Gulbenkian accepted to try the set, just to have it removed a few days later, thus liking the contrast of the bright colors with the sobriety of the staircase. Fireworks was the word used for Gulbenkian to describe these tapestries. Gulbenkian was particularly pleased, of course, to invite Fowles and Duveen to show off his latest acquisitions. One of the most remarkable visits takes place in October 1931. In this occasion, Fowles got to see the gallery of paintings, which he says to have been closed for nearly a year, a period during which it was entirely rearranged. As suggested before by Nuno, it is likely that this transformation was triggered by the arrival of the Hermitage purchase, which included the masterpieces highlighted by Fowles in his letter to Duveen, the Rembrandts and the Rubens. Gulbenkian was, of course, utterly proud of having achieved this stunning success without the assistance of the almighty Joe Duveen, and to have the paintings finally displayed in the gallery must have been a glorious moment. At the time, the collection included already approximately 200 paintings, and yet this room was not as large as one could imagine, notably when compared with the gallery that the Khan had in the same house, which was spread in 3 rooms. A rearrangement of the gallery was then necessary. When limiting our analysis to the photos, we are led to believe that the place of honor at the end of the room was occupied by Hubert Robert seen in a park above the chimneypiece, L'Argelière portrait of Thomas Germain and his wife, and Moroni's portrait of Marco Antonio Savelli. And yet, this composition tell us only a part of the story, namely that of the rearrangement that followed the loan to the National Gallery in 1936. Before this moment, and during what we can consider to be as the golden age of the gallery, when all of the jewels of the collection were still on site, the layout was considerably different, as you may have already guessed from the scheme on the right, which gives us a fairly good idea of how the presentation of the collection was subject to renewals. Thanks to this, we can now reconstruct the main wall of the gallery when the collection was at its peak, and Rubens' striking portrait of his wife, Helena Fourmin, presided over a room filled with fellow witnesses of Gulbenkian glories. This rearrangement meant, however, that other paintings had to leave and other rooms have to be organized. Let's consider the Corot and d'Aubigny that we can see in the Salon Sycomore and in the office of Madame Chanet, the curator of the collection. When they first entered the house in 1927, these paintings were all placed in the gallery of paintings, which by then looked much more modern, especially if you consider that the Monet and the Manet Boy with Cherries were also in the gallery. Indeed, it's only in 1931 that these paintings are relocated. The process of rehanging the paintings was frequently led by Auguste Decour, who succeeded Karbowski as the interior decorator. The Duveens were well acquainted with Decour, having collaborated in the creation of the Fragonard room in Henry Frick's house, as we saw earlier. One of the most interesting works commissioned to Decour was to lengthen Gulbenkian's bed, which was part of a bedroom set that once belonged to the famous French actor Talma. The purchase took place in 1929, having become in 1931 the basis of a new project of decoration of Gulbenkian's bedroom. In these recently discovered studies for the decoration of the room, we can clearly identify not only the bed, but also the two bedside tables and the two chiffonières bought at the Ney sale. At the time, the renowned landscape architect Achille Duchesne was working on the garden terrace located next to Gulbenkian private quarters, so it was only logical that he would also tackle this project. The Talma furniture can also be seen here in this photograph, as well as Rossolino's Virgin and Child, which was not always placed above the bed of Gulbenkian. In fact, when it first entered the house, the marble panel was placed in the dining room, thus emphasizing the ambience of an Italian Renaissance palace. In a way, the later transfer was a comeback, since while in London, the Rossolino was also in Gulbenkian's bedroom. The original composition at 51 was, however, a very different one. Indeed, despite being almost comical, records show that the Virgin and Child replaced a much more profane depiction, one of Charles Joshua Chaplin's sensual portraits of a young woman. This change suggests not only a shift of concept, but also bears testimony of the evolution of Gulbenkian's taste, which led him to dispose of some of his earlier purchases. Last one. The 51 Avenue d'Iéna has been seen as evidence of Gulbenkian's taste, but it's much more than that. When examined throughout its entire history, the house manifests itself as a reflection of the evolution of the art collector taste and achievements, one that was translated in new purchase, sales, loans, in the hanging and rehanging of paintings, in the change of pedestals and frames, in the rearrangement of vitrines, and ultimately in the creation of different layouts that show us how alive and fluid the collection was while housed at number 51. Thank you.
I will invite our speakers we at the time we're going to have this 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And I ask now some questions. I will call Who wants to start? No, well. Oh, wonderful. I was asking everyone wants to go to lunch, but...
Thank you. First of all, thank you to all three of you for your really interesting talks. I just wanted to know if parallels could be made between not only the actions of the oil barons, but also the media attention and the media reaction of the oil barons to the current purchases of big esteemed pieces of art by Middle Eastern fortunes and oil fortunes.
So you were asking, whether or not there are parallels with contemporary collecting today. Yeah. That's an interesting and contentious topic. I mean, yes, I guess. I think that people are concerned and interested in the social biographies of objects. I'm not just talking about provenance. I'm talking about cultural heritage, where things go, to whom they belong. To whom does culture belong? I mean, this is one of the issues about the Americans coming and doing their looting of these artworks in the late 19th century. That was, of course, nonsense, because half of them weren't British art anyway. So, it raises bigger conceptual issues about what role we think that museums play in particular societies, what audiences artworks should have. So, I mean, yes, there's a lot of media attention about what goes where, but I think it's incumbent on us to think more carefully about what role we think those works play in particular societies, where, often people don't see them anyway. So, I mean, I'd be happy for all of these works to be simply in public hands. The more I, sort of look at the art world, the more I become a Marxist. So if we had properly functioning systems of taxation and public funding of institutions, we wouldn't actually need private collections. So there's my contentious thought back at your contentious thought. Thank you for the question. Does anyone else want to?
Just sort of picking up on a couple of things Kathryn was saying. First of all, is how you define cultural identity and heritage. A couple of the examples I showed, one of course was the Holbein of Christina, Duchess of Milan, and the other one being the Velázquez, both rescued by the National Art Collections Fund, now of course known as the Art Fund. The case of Velázquez, it's by a Spanish artist, obviously. It had only been in England since the early 19th century. So I suppose that raises a question about, at what point does it become a national heritage item? In the case of the Holbein, which created a huge storm in the press, there was a particularly hilarious passage which I had to take out because I was running over time, about one of the newspapers saying, why do we need to worry about the Holbein? After all, he was a Bavarian artist. Should the painting not go back to Bavaria? So I think that's sort of one thought. What was the other thought? I can't remember really. No, you can't read my mind. I think I'll leave it there for a moment.
If I may, one of the most striking, not for Kathryn, but with respect also to Jeremy, is how the positive look that we have sometimes this creation of the train of treasuries going to America, but you explain so beautiful, and how this new dynamic and all this cultural creation and all this new approach to art. At the time, they could extremely wealthy people buy blank objects, but the scholarship that followed it. The not was in their project, maybe, but what I question is how did that change also the museums in Europe? So all this dynamism, we recognize still in the American museums, how they could change our scope in terms of like the catalogs, collections, when you start with the scandal with the Walpole sale, there was to be published a catalog.
Yes.
But we see what's happening in the United States. It's quite different or not? That's what I like to.
Well, let me dive in first of all with the Hôtel sale. One of the things which was really novel about that sale, in a sense, was the fact that James Christie, who of course was a very canny auctioneer, knew that in order to get the best price for that collection, he needed to have it endorsed. So he actually brought in the experts, who at that time were not art historians but artists like Benjamin West, to provide a relatively scholarly catalogue of the collection. This process then continues, and I think there is I slightly disagree with Kathryn about the kind of private versus, the evils of the private collecting system, as it were. I think things were much more permeable. Divisions were not so hard and fast in the past, and in 1857, with the Manchester Art Treasures exhibition, dealers played an enormously important role in putting together that exhibition. And although I don't like to keep on blowing the Colnaghi trumpet, but Colnaghi and Agnews published one of the first photographically illustrated blockbuster catalogues of all time, which certainly was useful for scholarship, but was also useful commercially, because that became a kind of shop window of things that might become available for sale, and indeed did become available for sale. I have come across, thinking about the crossover between museum world and the commercial world, Buddha was enormously invested in the art market. And I have never found any evidence that he ever did anything for his own personal profit. But he certainly was very ambitious for his museum. And in 1898, the Berlin Museum, Colnaghi and Wertheimer bought in a consortium, unthinkable today, with a museum being the partner in that consortium, the Hope collection of Dutch pictures. And one of those pictures, or two of them, in fact, a pair of them, the pair of Metsus, was sold to the diamond merchant Alfred Beit, with an endorsement from, guess who, Wilhelm von Bode. As a thank you present, Bode asks, and he makes it quite clear he wants a thank you present, for a Dürer painting on parchment, actually, which is sort of given as a thank you present, donated to the Berlin Museum to thank him for orchestrating that deal. And Langton Douglas, who takes over from Bernard Berenson as Duveen's sort of in-house expert, while he's working for the National Gallery in Ireland, is offering pictures on National Gallery of Ireland paper. So I'm not saying that that was a brilliant situation, but I'm just saying autre temps, autre mœurs, there was a great deal of permeability, and it wasn't all for the bad, I think.
Yeah, so I don't think I disagree with you. I mean, at least in part, and that was sort of where I ended up with my last slides. I think there was a great permeability between public and private at this time. And certainly when someone like Morgan is gifting works to the Met or loaning them, it's almost as though the Met is an extension of his private residence or a replacement of it, given that so much of his private collection remained at the time in London. Same with Jack Morgan using the Met to exhibit the works. So yes, I think there was, and I think that played into that sort of image of the collector as the cultural authority, as a cultural leader and tastemaker. Where we end up in my narrative is with a taste for art collecting. I mean, there's not enough old masters to go round, so that creating a taste for art buying. People are going to start looking to other options, including, in this case, American art. So it's not sort of making a taste for old masters, it's making a taste for art and art collecting. Do you want to
To what extent, I really appreciate your comment about making a taste for collecting, whatever the category be. And we see that, of course, in the art market over the last 15 or 20 years, where entirely new areas arrive as opportunities for established collectors. But to what extent were people like Gulbenkian and the new industrial fortunes, the new financial fortunes of that time, inspired by their perceptions of great royal collections? I'm thinking not only in terms of their decor, classic Louis XV, Louis XVI, but also their perception of what they should have in their collections to endorse those collections as important ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that quote about bankers or J.P. Morgan replacing the crowned heads of Europe. I mean, this is a new kind of cultural class trying to compete with and outbid the Europeans. So yes, I think there was certainly cultural emulation there that has had obviously lasting effects on contemporary museum culture. And what we think is good art, what we value about art, we're the legatees of that. So I think that's a massive issue. Do you want to speak more specifically about Gulbenkian?
No, exactly.
Particularly his decor, his taste.
I would just like to say something about that. Just to bring in the Islamic side, because we haven't seen any much Islamic here. But just to say that when you go and look, and I mean, you'll be able to help me with this, I mean that the late 19th century Ottoman palaces, if you look there, you see all of Gulbenkian's taste, as it's quite remarkable today, because we're not used to studying Ottoman palaces. But there you have the combination of the Persian carpet with beautiful 18th century furniture, with glass, with decorative arts. This is really Ottoman taste. And in many ways, although he's buying almost his entire collection in Europe, it's actually fed, I think, by his experiences as a young man in Istanbul and having access through his status and society in which he is operating to those kinds of spaces.
But that's a great point, because you know that brings in the cultural biography of the objects, but combining them in new ways gives life to a new entity, which is the collection. So that's a massively important step.
I mean, you know that our museum now is separated, so we have all the Eastern things, so-called Eastern things on one side and all the so-called Western things on the other. And this was considered to be the museography, the perfect museography of 1969. But I think the more that I work with young people around the collection, what they would really like to see is the mixing that Gulbenkian was doing in his own home. So you'll be able to see a little bit of that now in our new 18th century galleries. There's some more integration.
Thank you, Jessica. I think we can return, please.
I wonder, it's my question probably, what was the connections between Monsieur Calouste and Mr. Gulbenkian and this other very important collectors at the time?
One thing that replying to a question, but also Jessica and Kathryn comment, that's very interesting. The difference between those men that apparently whose past who had some links and some connection, but then the way they collect is rather different in some aspects. And it's interesting to see how, for instance, Gulbenkian, besides the Islamic art and all that, he has these paintings from Zaim that show us these beautiful views of Istanbul. And Calouste had those too in his early days, but then he goes and he sells everything. And Gulbenkian is always very linked and connected with his past and his heritage. Is so present in a way that you don't see in other collectors from the same time that have some kind of the same collections or the same taste. So the heritage is definitely there, and the way he was able to display the collection in such a beautiful way that I feel that sometimes when you look in those photographs and you have Renaissance high relief, and then the Disney ceramics, and then the medieval sculpture on the side. And you kind of forget, it's so beautifully done that you kind of forget that you are crossing all these times and culture and geographies. It's very Gulbenkian, but at the same time, it's so beautifully done that you almost forget. You don't forget because you clearly can see the difference, but it's so beautifully done that it all belongs together. It was like it was made to be together and mixed, like Jessica was saying. Like it's not now in the museum, and it's very important to have, I think, this other view, or this view of Gulbenkian and his house and his collection, because it complements a visit to the museum, because it gives us the way as that the collector had on his own collection, because the way he presents the collection in the house, it was the way that he felt that the collection and the objects should be seen and interpreted and enjoyed, and it's totally different of what is happening in the museum. So complements each other, I think.
Professor Howard, what is the current situation in Britain concerning taxes on the remaining great collection in Britain? Is there an effort from the British legislature to keep things in England, or is still the idea of get the most of taxes and penalize, the patrimony?
Well, I think the law has become more beneficial or benevolent, I should say, perhaps, towards the idea of trying to keep collections together. We have had for a long time a system of acceptance in lieu of death duties, and so this means that objects, if they are given to museums, there is a douceur which is given to owners to encourage them to do that, and that principle was extended to a principle of acceptance in lieu in situ, where particularly furniture, which makes, of course, great sense in its original architectural context, is allowed to remain in that architectural context, providing that it's reasonably accessible to the public. An example of that is at Longleat, where the furniture was accepted in lieu in situ. There is, I think, actually, some other people here might know a little bit more than I do about how. I think that the law has been changing a little bit towards a system of more of kind of acceptance in lieu, inter vivos, rather than just in lieu of death duties. So it is changing all the time, and I think one of the things that came out of that, of the 1909 sort of great year of anxiety about the national heritage, was the big debates going on at the time as to whether Britain should follow Italy. And in 1909, Italy had greatly tightened up on their export procedures. It wasn't, it was a progressive thing, but 1909 is really the point where there is a listing system, there's a far more comprehensive system in order to prevent patrimonio nazionale leaving Italy. And there were big debates about whether we should institute that in this country. Unfortunately, a lot of the people who were in very powerful positions on boards of trustees were also owners of great ancestral art collections. Most of the trustees of the National Gallery fell into that category. So it didn't really go very far. And for example, in 1911, one of the trustees of the National Gallery sells off a famous Rembrandt, The Mill. It's not really until, it takes quite a long time for Britain to get to a point where it's actually works out a compromise in a typically British way between the interests of private owners and the art market on one side and the protection of heritage on the other, and brings in the Waverley criteria for what is of national importance, and tries to think about a sensible system of balancing tax relief and thereby allowing, of course, museums time to raise the money to match what the American buyer has just offered, let's say, for a work of art. I'm just using American as an example because that's, that tends to be particularly where the threat was perceived to come from. But so anyway, does that answer your question? I mean, I don't feel I'm not an art lawyer. That's the thing. Yeah.
I mean, I think your point's a good one, and it doesn't just affect cultural heritage; it's contemporary art as well. I mean, we're seeing a rise of private museums everywhere, and most of them fueled by works bought on the market at the moment. So again, and these benefit from tax regimes that as Jeremy said, help people during their lifetime. So, I think as art audiences, it's something we need to think about, where we think contemporary art belongs, what we think should happen to works owned in private hands right now, where they're best suited and what tax regimes should or should not be in place.
May I say something about the legal structures in place in India? Because it's a really fascinating case where during the British period, of course, many great works of art left India, many as presents, as diplomatic presents from Indian princes to the royal family. Many things were taken. I'm speaking not only of archaeology, but also miniature paintings, manuscripts, or anything that could be moved. Even if it couldn't be moved, it was often removed. What happens after independence is, from 1947 onwards, it's the Indian royal families that start to take their heritage out as a way of protecting their wealth. So they start to remove their jewels, they start to remove their cars, they start to sell libraries to dealers. And finally, in 1971, India puts in a very strict legislation. Nothing of more than 100 years can be exported from the country. Nothing at all. It could be a very boring picture frame of 1911. It cannot be removed from India. And it has led to a very, very strange situation in the country because it's completely blocked the art market, that things that should be allowed to move can't be moved. And so it's driven an underground market where things are purposely wrongly identified, constantly on invoices, where objects are hidden in other objects to be exported. And it's meant that the real value of Indian works of art cannot be achieved, because how can you value Indian works of art if you cannot freely import or export things into India? So, for example, when I was working at Christie's and had Indian clients who wanted to buy Impressionist paintings, they would buy them and leave them in their apartments in London. Because once you take anything over 100 years of age, or if it's 60 or 70 years, you run the risk that your next generation will never be able to export it. And so it's led to a very, very strange situation.
Thank you. I mean, before we went to lunch, I would die if I not say this. It terms that all the scenery we've been discussing this morning, and all the day, between public and private collections. It's also interesting phenomenon that was very important as we are in Paris and France and its building. Look a little, just a reference to the importance that it had in the 18th century, the sale catalogs written by Marchand Mercier, also I think about Gersaint or others, that became private collections, that became public through the catalogs. And they are a source for one of, but this movement continues. This is quite interesting. But this as a reference to our French Marchand Mercier that are so present here upstairs.
I would like to thank the three of you very much for leading the morning session, and to Nuno for being an excellent moderator. I'd like to invite you all for lunch, which is a simple stand-up lunch next door in our meeting room. And I think we reconvene in about 1 hour's time.